Welcome back to In-Depth Literature, everybody's favorite place on the internet. Today we are going to be exploring the epic, grandiose world of Thomas Wolfe's Of Time in the River. This is the subsequent sequel to Look Homeward Angel, following the legacy of Eugene Gant as well as his family. But what's interesting about Of Time in the River is that we see a drastic departure, not only with as far as the characters are concerned, but also thematically, with sort of the coming of age story that took place with Look Homeward Angel. Of Time in the River has some of those elements of a man growing older, throwing himself into the throes of the world, into the epic, vast landscape, or wasteland rather, of America, but the beautiful experience of a man's awakening. And we are detached from, or Thomas Wolfe graduates from, that sort of maybe immature coming of age analysis that we saw in of Look Homeward Angel. But what's interesting about it to me is the way that the novel is sort of split into two different narratives. The first part of Time in the River is almost a continuation of Look Homeward Angel, but we see new faces, new characters, new emotions, and the title of Time in the River really sorts to start to manifest halfway through the novel, where this motif of the river really becomes the sort of lifeblood of Thomas Wolfe's new worldview, and sort of the river functions as this ebb and flow of the American experience, and how the river is constantly flowing and constantly pulling us back and forwards and in all directions throughout the human experience, and how the past and the present are completely intertwined with sort of the motif of the river. I'm going to put this book down because it's probably at least 7 or 8 pounds. It's a really heavy novel, published in 1935, and Thomas Wolfe spent years and years and years writing Of Time in the River, as he did obviously Look Homeward Angel. And I would say that Of Time in the River, we have sort of the continuation of the Gant family experience, the very traumatic family drama between, Eliza Gant and William Oliver Gant, as well as the death of Benjamin Gant, Thomas Wolfe's brother, that takes place at the end of Look Homeward Angel, where he gets these ghost-like visitations, and the traumatic bedside death scene of Benjamin Gant that the family has to experience. And sort of the beginning of the novel, and just a quick one of my annotations here says, "The power of Eugene's life and worldview is how the people in his life influence him. An autobiographical novel, as Wolfe demonstrates, is only partly based on the main protagonist, but more heavily influenced by the interactions with others." And that's what I've never understood about the Thomas Wolfe critics is, they've always claimed that he could only write about himself. And yes, he's writing about his own worldview, but Thomas Wolfe is actually spending more time into the lives of his family, his friends, and his lovers, and the vast American landscape that Thomas Wolfe is particularly interested in. He spends more time on that than he does writing about himself. Yes, the Eugene Gant sort of character, Thomas Wolfe character, is the central protagonist, but everybody else that he relates to is actually more profound than he is, because without these individuals, there would be no story, there would be no character arc. And sadly, what we get with Of Time in the River as well is the last saga of the Gant family, of the Eugene Gant protagonist that we saw in the early days of Look Homeward Angel. Post Of Time in the River, we see this new protagonist named George Webber, obviously, that pops up when we get to Of the Web and the Rock and You Can't Go Home Again. And obviously, he's a very similar sort of Eugene-esque Thomas Wolfe character, but he's a new entity. He's more of connected to the web of life, which is sort of a reference to George Webber, his last name, and how he is, the family dynamic is a little bit different. He's an orphan. His college experience is different. His family relationships are a little bit different. His friendships, his love affairs are different. So I would hate to dwell too much on the fact that Thomas Wolfe never really solidified or finished the Eugene Gant family legacy, the family story, but I think this is probably as close as we'll ever get to speculating on what it would have been like if Thomas Wolfe had not abandoned the protagonist Eugene Gant, and maybe if he had further explored his family lineage with the Gant family. But obviously Thomas Wolfe was always immensely interested throughout his writing career in sort of creating this universal universe, I guess you could say, universal rhetoric of how his family's impact influenced him and his existential obsession with his family heritage, his family lineage throughout the mysteries of the American South. But also what we see in Of Time in the River is that the story begins with Eugene Gant, Thomas Wolfe, at the train station where he's actually heading out to leave for college. And obviously we had the motif of the trains in Look Homeward Angel, and that continues in Of Time in the River, where the railroad and the train is sort of function as this metaphor for freedom, to sort of bring the youth, the particular feelings of inadequate youth that brings you to the future, that brings you to potential, that brings you to the big cities of colleges and beautiful women and big businesses and all this money and all this potential that is sort of that these characters are fantasizing about. And the railroad sort of is sort of a motif to sort of bring Eugene Gant out of the primitiveness of Altamont, North Carolina, which is obviously a sit-in for Asheville, North Carolina. And we have this beautiful sort of exchange with Eliza Gant and Mabel Gant and all of Thomas Wolfe's sisters and some of the other characters that come in from the village to sort of see the young Eugene Gant / Thomas Wolfe off to college. He is headed for Harvard, Massachusetts, and he ends up going on to teach at Harvard University. And so also what Of Time in the River functions as is almost like this beautiful meditative existential meditation on the death of his family's legacy with the death of William Oliver Gant, which we'll get to shortly. But also it serves as this meditation on sort of the young career man being thrown into the abyss of not only the creative endeavor, but also what it's like to actually be a professor. We have these beautiful meditations and studies and monologues on the tensions between professor versus student. And Thomas Wolfe talks about sort of this gaping void that serves as this metaphor for the ever so hungry and bloodthirsty need that the students have for knowledge that the professor cannot really live up to. But like I said, going back to the beginning of the novel, he sort of restructures the importance of the Gant family in terms of Altamont and obviously Asheville and the old Kentucky home and Dixieland, and I'm sort of riffing back and forth between the actual historical names and places versus the way that Thomas Wolfe sort of fictionalized them, and sometimes I get them a little mixed up. I'll speak about them interchangeably, but we also have these beautiful recollections of the struggles and toils between William Oliver Gant and his mother and Thomas Wolfe's mother, Eliza Gant. Never saw eye to eye. They were always at odds. William Oliver Gant ends up sort of deteriorating and just surpassing into this morose, depressive, bitter alcoholic. But we also get these beautiful retrospective narratives about William Oliver Gant, Thomas Wolfe's father, and we almost pity this old man, this old character who has been a stonemason his whole life. And Thomas Wolfe had these beautiful descriptions about his father's hands and how his father is part of the earth. His father nurtures from the earth, and he talks about his father's lunging, earth-devouring stride, and the fact that even though his father was kind of a morose, abusive alcoholic, his father always provided for the family. If you read Look Homeward Angel, you'll get, or even Oh Lost, for example, you'll get even more of a retrospective narrative about William Oliver Gant as well as Eliza Gant. And also some of Eliza's family heritage comes up, Julia Wolfe. And we're going to kind of analyze the most important themes of the book, the most important, beautiful, poignant sections of this novel. And the first part of this novel really functions as the continuation of Look Homeward Angel. The first book 1, book 2 into book 3, I would say, is really the end of that sort of Thomas Wolfe Altamont universe that we came to know through Look Homeward Angel. And there's this beautiful retrospective of Thomas Wolfe leaving the nest, so to speak, for the first time, and he ends up coming back and then having to leave the nest, of course. If you've read Of Time in the River, this is our second rereading of it, so this book will take many years to master, and you will read Of Time in the River, endlessly throughout your life, as you will Look Homeward Angel or Oh Lost or The Web and the Rock, as well as You Can't Go Home Again, as well as The Hills Beyond, and any work by Thomas Wolfe. But by the time we get to the ending section of book one, which is titled, this book is split up into maybe 3 or 4 books. The first part is called Book 1, Orestes, Flight Before Fury, and that sort of functions as Thomas Wolfe's angsty late teenage years, having to leave his family, and there's all this family drama at the train station. But Thomas Wolfe is graduating, he's leaving the nest, he's going off to Harvard, he's got all of this potential and all this wonderful dreams that he's aspiring to, and his family is kind of rooting for him, but at the same time, they're still kind of trying to pull him back into this old classic family drama that Thomas Wolfe and Eugene Gant are just so tired of, they're so drained of. And by the time we get to book 2, called Young Faustus, is basically the beginning section of this book is an exploration of the death of William Oliver Gant. But book 2 really functions as sort of the end of the Gant family legacy with the death of William Oliver Gant, but also what's profound and what's beautifully retrospective and how it kind of links back to Look Homeward Angel is that we get these beautiful meditations about the family recalling and remembering their brother Ben, Thomas Wolfe's brother, with the ending chapters of Look Homeward Angel. And just what a visceral, profound experience the death of Ben Gant was on the Thomas Wolfe and Gant family. Obviously, the Gant is the fictional name for Wolfe, so I'm kind of using them interchangeably. But also, we realized that this was mentioned briefly in Look Homeward Angel, that Ben's twin brother actually died of typhoid fever in childbirth, like way before Thomas Wolfe was even born, late 1800s, I believe. So, and we get the idea that Eliza Gant, Julia Wolfe, is never able to really come to terms or really get over the trauma of losing 2 of her sons. Meditations on how Thomas Wolfe is able to sympathize with the feminine experience. Obviously, Thomas Wolfe is a very masculine writer. He writes about his father, he writes about himself, he writes about sexuality and lust, but we get these beautiful sections, these beautiful pages and chapters upon chapters of what the suffering was like from the female perspective in his family. He really feels for his mother, who, had to sort of break away from William Oliver Gant, and she had to make her own way. And the frustrations that Thomas Wolfe had of being raised in her boarding house, which William Oliver Gant called the murderous bloody barn, and how he sort of juxtaposes the old Kentucky home with the home of his father, which he recalls as a place of abundance and of warmth. And he talks about his father's lunging, earth-devouring stride, and how he would come home and have meat and all this food on the table. But he did suffer from terrible alcoholism, and he started to drink, and that's sort of when the family started to fall apart, and Eliza Gant had to sort of make her own way throughout the vast epic wasteland of America. And we also have these beautiful sections of just Thomas Wolfe's family tension sort of coming up, but we get not only Thomas Wolfe's worldview, Eugene Gant's worldview, but also how all the other characters, his sisters, his brothers that are still alive, we get these retrospectives from his father, William Oliver Gant, dying on the deathbed, and it was sort of how the family is still bickering. And we also come to understand that William Oliver Gant is a bit of a narcissist, because he is getting narcissistic supply, we could say, on the fact that he is suffering and his family is having to suffer along with him while he dies of cancer. But we get these beautiful meditations on how his father is basically an extension of the southern universe, and how his father's hands are one with the soil of the South and with the everlasting passage of time of the South. And also we get that with Eliza Gant, but we get this notion that Thomas Wolfe's father worked with his hands, so he's almost like this saint-like, Christ-like figure that sort of functions as this ancient carpenter figure like we would have maybe with Christ in the New Testament, but how his father by lieu of his trade, the fact that he was a stonemason, that his essence and his spirit comes from the ancient earth. His spirit comes from the south, and that his father is sort of this mysterious man. And in Look Homeward Angel, when he talks about of a leaf, of a stone, of a door, and of all the forgotten faces, and just sort of this existential, beautiful meditation on the vast existential experience of what it is to be in a family, right? The family tensions, the lost loves, the painful love that we feel for our family, even though they make us struggle, they make us toil, and all the different complex family dynamics, but also the existential memories and the crisis of the briefness of our days that Thomas Wolfe is extremely concerned with. And so by the time we get a little further into book 2, about page 184, we have the Charles Scribner's edition. This is a newer edition. I recommend getting this one. If you don't have this one, if you might have an older copy, which is pretty cool because it might be worth something, but this is really the best, the most readable. It's got really dark, beautiful print that's well spaced on the page. And also, so during this point in the novel, we sort of start to have these meditations on Thomas Wolfe's collegiate peers, as well as all the characters that he's meeting throughout the epic world, the universe of America. But we get these interesting characters such as Wang, who's Thomas Wolfe's Chinese friend up at Harvard University, who is he's a bit of a troll, and he goes up to Thomas Wolfe in the middle of class or in the middle of some potentially serious situation, and Wang purposely makes these exchanges awkward, and he accuses Eugene Gant of sort of being intimate or hooking up with these voluptuous fat women, and he says, yes, I saw you making love to big fat girl, and just these really hilarious exchanges of this friendship that takes place between Eugene Gant and his friend, his Chinese friend Wang, and they sort of share this little apartment wing together. And also we have the study, there's a little bit, some sketches of Thomas Wolfe's playwright professor, which are pretty profound, and Thomas Wolfe is sort of confronting the struggle of what it means to be a creative author in America. How can he set himself apart? How can he set himself apart from not only the previous lineage of authors that he's inspired by, but also his professors and his peers and his family members? And fast forwarding a little bit further, Thomas Wolfe goes to stay with Eliza Gant's brother, who is Eugene's uncle, known as Bascom Pentland, and he's this eccentric, this overzealous vegetarian who feasts on raw vegetables every night and condemns meat eaters. And just to think that veganism was a thing back then, I didn't even realize it. But Thomas Wolfe's uncle was this almost religious zealot, sort of almost the opposite of William Oliver Wolfe or even Eliza Gant. And we don't really get the sense that he's particularly that Bascom Pentland is close with Thomas Wolfe's mother, but we get this beautiful relationship that Bascom Pentland tries to take the young Eugene Gant under his wing, and he's married to this sort of quirky old lady, and they have this bickering sort of relationship that you might expect from an old couple, and just these beautiful exchanges of Thomas Wolfe reliving his family heritage and how strange and sort of quirky and bizarre family history can be, how bizarre our family members can actually be. Fast forwarding to page 214, we get these really sad meditations on the abusive history of William Oliver Gant upon his family and Eliza Wolfe, Julia Wolfe rather, just the tensions that have never really been forgiven between William Oliver Gant and Eliza Gant. Incredibly visceral, traumatic experiences that not only sort of were never forgiven, that never sort of were solved in the beginning, but now they're coming back to the forefront because of William Oliver Gant is sort of manipulating everybody and sort of condemning them and saying that, I provided for this family and now everything has been a waste and now I'm dying and nobody appreciates me. And having said the fact that William Oliver Gant is dying, Thomas Wolfe's father is dying, we also get this incredibly poignant retrospectives about Thomas Wolfe's brother and how his family is never really able to get over the death of his family. I believe Ben died in 1918 of influenza, aka the Spanish flu, which was included in the subsequent final chapters of Look Homeward Angel. And of course, we have, all of these beautiful retrospective scenes about Thomas Wolfe's sisters and his mothers and his fathers and his cousins. But sort of, fast forwarding to the later part of book 2, Thomas Wolfe is really starting to try to shed this family trauma. He can no longer linger in Altamont because he realizes that the train is out there. Harvard is out there. The potential life is waiting for the young Eugene Gant, but he is constantly being dragged down into the abyss by the family trauma, by the alcoholism, by his mother's sort of pesky, greedy nature. And she works at the boarding house, and his sisters are all defeated. They're all kind of bitter, and they've been kind of just chewed up and spit out by the old primitive American South. The last section of the first part of the novel basically functions as this meditation of Thomas Wolfe sort of coming back to Altamont with his tail in between his legs because he's been at Harvard, right? And he's been taking some teaching positions, or this was actually before he started teaching, but he's been to Harvard, and he comes back because just to spend some time with his family after his father passes away. And he believes that they are going to put one of his plays on the stage production. They're going to do a production of one of his plays. And I would say that Thomas Wolfe's playwriting career, his plays are probably my least explored genre of Thomas Wolfe. I've read his essays, I've read his short stories, and of course we've read all of his novels and the sort of the novella of The Hills Beyond. But Thomas Wolfe begun as a playwright, and we should thank Elaine Bernstein, aka Esther Jack, for sort of convincing the young Thomas Wolfe to switch from writing plays to writing novels, because could you imagine trying to sit through a Thomas Wolfe play? It would probably never end. But he sort of reconnects with this ne'er-do-well character called Robert Weaver. And Robert Weaver was, I shouldn't say a ne'er-do-well, but he was a creative peer of Thomas Wolfe in the early days of Thomas Wolfe's college career. But he returns to Massachusetts, to Harvard, as sort of a morose alcoholic, and he sort of starts to lead the young Eugene Gant in the wrong direction. And he comes to live with Thomas Wolfe, and Eugene Gant is kind of afraid of this Robert Weaver character because he just sees and witnesses the alcohol pulsing through his blood, and he realizes that this Robert Weaver character is acting irrationally, and Eugene is suffering this existential crisis after he gets a letter in the mail that his play has been rejected, and he is forced to face the adolescent struggles, the late teenage years of existential failure that we all feel. I know I'm still dealing with those as a young man, as a middle-aged man even now, and sort of all that sense of failure and that sense of disappointment that we all feel in terms of how we relate to ourselves and how our family looks upon us. And Thomas Wolfe is so depressed, he ends up going on a binge with Robert Weaver, and they end up traveling just in the middle of nowhere into the old ancient South. Robert Weaver's behind the wheel, completely blacked out, driving drunk, and they get pulled over in this really small, cryptic, strange southern town, and these brutal cops sort of, capture him and drag him into jail, and they throw Eugene Gant into a jail cell with a Negro, which back then was like the worst thing you could probably do to somebody like Eugene Gant. Just the racial tensions back then were much more profound than they are now in some ways. But obviously a lot of things have not changed in the Old South. But in particular, we have these, very visceral, disturbing meditations of Eugene Gant being locked into prison in this really smelly, old, demented jail with these brutal, fat, red-faced, alcoholic Southern cops, and they throw Thomas Wolfe in a cell with somebody that he does not want to be with, and he's completely drunk. They were drinking corn whiskey on the way there and just speeding through all these old Southern towns, but eventually they were caught, and Eugene Gant starts to sort of rebel, and he starts to shake the bars of the jail cell, and he starts to use his head and his body as a battering ram to sort of start to rebel, and he's going crazy and he's hallucinating, and he's begging these police to get him out of this cell with this other prisoner. And also what's interesting is Thomas Wolfe explains that although he's in a jail cell with a black person, he does not really have any antagonistic hatred feelings towards this individual. He was just basically placing all the blame on the cops and the fact that they try to humiliate him, and he's banging his head against the jail cell. And finally his brother comes to rescue him from the jail, and subsequently, as a result of this, Thomas Wolfe, Eugene Gant, is forced to return back to the nest, and he has to face his sisters and his older brother, and obviously Eliza Gant, with the humiliation and the failures of being arrested in this old evil southern town. And his mother breaks down into tears. And fast forwarding a little bit, we talked a little bit about this in the first Thomas Wolfe retrospective that we did, but we have these beautiful monologues of Thomas Wolfe when he finally leaves the nest, and he is finally able to leave his mother's boarding house. And he talks about how he hears the distant howling of the wind, and the demented wind, and the echo of the train leaving him behind in the distance. And he realizes in that instant, when he sees his mother putting in her false teeth, and he wakes her up from sleep one night, under the guise of attempting to tell her all these prophetic, inspirational, loving things that a son always wants to tell his mother. But we sort of get this reference back to the forgotten language, that language of love and of family that we're never able to speak. We always sort of have our guard up. And Thomas Wolfe explores that sort of existential familial tension just so brilliantly and so beautifully. And he leaves again sort of with his tail in between his legs, but this time he is going to do it, and he ends up becoming a teacher at Harvard University. And I will say that roughly around page 420 is really my favorite part of the novel, where Thomas Wolfe is juggling his responsibilities as a professor as well as his desire to become a writer. And we get these beautiful, horrifying scenes of how Thomas Wolfe views his role as a professor, and he fears that his peers and his higher-ups are going to discover his inadequacies. And he talks about this metaphor of this gaping, sort of vampiric, succulent maw, this ever-thirsty, unquenchable knowledge of the student body, and of how they are trying to suck all of the professor's energy, and how he feels that when he is going to teach a class in front of these young students, that he is almost being thrust. He's also almost being dragged upon the gallows to his subsequent death, because he is so existentially disturbed by this interaction between professor and student. He feels like he cannot live up to the expectations of his peers and of the pressures of the University of Harvard, as well as the ever bloodthirsty expectations of his students, and his students are always trying to outdo him. And he talks about tossing and turning in the middle of the night as he's grading papers, and how bad some of these students' essays are. But there is one student in particular named Abe Spears that he ends up at first having a terrible conflict with, because Abe Spears is kind of like this troll. He's like this contrarian, rather, and he complains after every class that Eugene Gant teaches, and says that, you are not teaching us very well. You are not challenging us, Mr. Gant. We pay good money to go to this Harvard University, and all you're doing is saying the same old talking points of old professors. And then Thomas Wolfe has this huge blowout with this Jewish student named Abe Spears, and says, well, if you don't like my class, I've had about enough of you, and you can leave my class. I will not have you in my class. And he takes his book and he shakes it in front of Abe Spears, and then they have this really sort of intimate confrontation. But by the end of it, Abe Spears breaks down into tears, and he describes to Eugene Gant that, no, honest, I love your class. Please don't make me leave your class. The only reason I challenge you is because you're the best professor professor I've ever had. And they actually become brilliant friends, and they become confidants, but they were not able to really see eye to eye before that because Abe Spears saw so much potential, and he enjoyed the collegiate interactions, the academic interactions so much with Thomas Wolfe that he constantly berated him. He constantly berated the character Eugene Gant because he was trying to find some weakness within him that Eugene Gant was exuding. He knew Eugene Gant was insecure. He knew he was sort of emotionally stunted by his own insecurities. And Abe Spears really helps to bring out the solution of Thomas Wolfe's personal insecurities and his personal anxieties. And later on in that section of the book, we get these beautiful studies. He really gets to know Abe Spears and his family's Jewish heritage, and we get these beautiful retrospectives of Abe Spears' mother, hardships that Abe Spears' family had to grow up with, and we sort of get this idea that yes, not all Jewish people are rich, and it's just all this really beautiful sort of poignant information about how Thomas Wolfe was able to really come to know his Jewish student Abe Spears and also his family through the monologues of his family. He got to know Abe Spears much better through the lineage and the family history of Abe Spears, and got closer to him as student to peer, as a professor to peer rather. Also, obviously the title of the novel of Time in the River comes up again and again, and we get these beautiful sort of passages of how the river is ever flowing, not only within the human soul and the human heart, but also within the epic experience of America. Part of being an American is to experience the ever-flowing rivers. And Eugene Gant talks about how the rivers sort of burst out of the caverns of the earth, and they sort of bring humanity back and forth. And, man has sort of been forged not only by the ocean, but obviously by the rivers, and how we've used rivers to travel. And we could just get these wonderful passages of sort of the existential eternity of the river, and how the earth and the river will always be here much longer than humanity itself. Also, we get, more meditations on sort of this psychosexual tension of Thomas Wolfe versus his female students. And he talks about here, he says, the end of each class left him zapped, gutted, drained, and with a sense of sterility, loss, and defeat. And in addition to this exhaustion of the mind and spirit, there was added a terrible weariness and frustration of the flesh. The potent young Jewish, thick, hot, and heavy with a female odor, swarmed around him in a sensual tide. They leaned above him as he sat there at his table, pressing deliberately the crisp nozzles of their melon-heavy breast against his shoulder. Erotically, they moved their bellies into him or rubbed the heavy contours of their thighs against his legs. They looked at him with moist red lips through which their wet red tongues lolled wickedly, and they sat upon the front rows of the class in garments cut with too extreme a style of provocation and indecency, staring up at him with eyes of round, lewd innocence, and just these beautiful sort of sexual, sensual tensions that Thomas Wolfe feels for his young female students, and also the motif of sort of the back and forth debate between professor and student, and how the professor and the student are constantly having to outdo themselves. Who's the most knowledgeable, and sort of the unsatiable desire for knowledge that the students have, and the students are not comfortable with this authoritative figure that Eugene Gant has sort of been forced to become. And now we've been reading this so much that the book is starting to split there at the top, as you can see. We'll have to use some super glue there. So fast forwarding a little bit more, Robert Weaver shows up, and Eugene Gant / Thomas Wolfe gets into more. Robert Weaver continues to drag down Thomas Wolfe, and he's just this incredibly narcissistic but sympathetically interesting character. And Robert Weaver has this affair with this married woman, and he's sharing an apartment with Eugene Gant, and the man sort of shows up with a gun to kill Robert Weaver, and Thomas Wolfe is having to constantly bail out Robert Weaver from his own sort of, failures as a person. So fast forwarding a little bit more, we have some more motifs about the river. And also, we talked about in the first Thomas Wolfe retrospective how Thomas Wolfe is always concerned and always passionate about the racial experience, the racial tensions in America with Jews and blacks and also the Asians that come up. And obviously, we don't have a lot of real poignant, important African American characters in Of Time in the River, but they do come up. And Thomas Wolfe is perfectly aware and passionately aware of the African American experience in America and how the contribution of the black community is not insignificant, how America would not be able to really function without the experience, the black experience. So we get these monologues of different exchanges between black characters and sort of Thomas Wolfe's sort of stupefied wonder and fascination with other races that he doesn't really quite understand, but he realizes are part of the beautiful story, the epic nature of America. And that's something so special about Thomas Wolfe that I think gets overlooked. Thomas Wolfe is considered offensive. And also something else that comes up is that a lot of Thomas Wolfe critics claim is, like Harold Bloom, for example, claimed that Thomas Wolfe is forever the eternal adolescent and that his readers are the eternal adolescent. But that's not really true because Thomas Wolfe comes to age in Of Time in the River. He grows up, and we get these, beautiful passages of Thomas Wolfe leaving his youth behind. And obviously, there's that sense of, the wandering Shakespearean fool, the wandering youth, the eternal youth, perhaps, but Thomas Wolfe's youth obviously is way long behind him in the final chapters of Look Homeward Angel. And what we are forced to accept is that Eugene Gant is now sort of out in the abyss, in the chaos of the world. And we talked about Thomas Wolfe's fascination with America, but also what takes place later in the later parts of the novel is Thomas Wolfe goes to, obviously he leaves Altamont, North Carolina. He goes to Massachusetts and Harvard. He goes to New York City where he lives, and that's where he meets up with Abe Spears. And then he migrates his way to Europe. And Thomas Wolfe at last finally leaves the shackles of the American experience, and we're finally able to experience Eugene Gant as a grown man, as a character, interacting with all these wonderful other characters in the web of human experience. And we get these beautiful chapters where Thomas Wolfe is living in these strange apartments and strange boarding houses with these strange people. And he falls in love with this woman that is part of this family community that has been shunned. It's never actually told in the novel, and we don't quite know what happened to these people that Thomas Wolfe is living with, but they've been completely dejected and sort of rejected by society. And there's some secret there that Thomas Wolfe is unaware of, but he talks about living in the house with these strange spectral people and that they're all at peace together because they've all kind of been rejected and they've all been kind of wandering and looking for a home, looking for that unopened door, that door that they can walk into, that language that they can speak. And we get these beautiful studies of Thomas Wolfe's obsession with the existential crisis of time, his interest in his family lineage, but also in the lineage of the American versus European experience. And he sort of juxtaposes the wandering, insatiable appetite of Americans versus the more confident, more ancient, profound experience of Europe, and how Europe is sort of a more solidified society versus the young and upcoming youthful experience of America. And Thomas Wolfe is constantly Eugene Gant rather, is constantly looking for a place to write. And we get these beautiful meditations on the creative experience, how Thomas Wolfe is sort of creatively stalling and he's constantly looking for a place to settle down and to write, but he never actually does it until we get to the last couple sections of Time in the River, because Thomas Wolfe, Eugene Gant, is kind of, constantly wasting time. He's kind of constantly waiting for experience to come to him as opposed to really making an experience of his own. And he's kind of relying on all these eccentric ne'er-do-well characters to give his art some kind of creative meaning. But really the springs of creativity were always in Eugene Gant to begin with, but he's constantly been distracted. We kind of get the sense of that. And he ends up meeting all these characters of all shapes and sizes. He starts to live with this old lady who is encouraging him to sort of tell everybody in France that he's working for the New York Times, and Thomas Wolfe refuses to live a lie. He does not want to tell these people that he's working for the New York Times, but this lady is trying to open him up to other opportunities. And she talks about how the people in France view Americans as, these, ever successful, prestigious people, and Thomas Wolfe is just becomes disillusioned with the deception of having to live a lie with these people in France, and just these. And on chapter, I'm not even sure. I think this is book 4 or something. Page 837, we get these beautiful sort of spontaneous meditations, almost poetic prose of just really insignificant things, but Thomas Wolfe, it brings all kinds of significant things to them, like the chiming of a bell or a Mozart symphony, and he draws parallels to the ancient Greeks in the Third Crusade and the ancient Egypt and all these insignificant things throughout our life, almost like this. If you've ever heard the Imaginarum album by Nightwish, this is kind of what this chapter sort of sounds like. It's just almost this Whitman-esque, Walt Whitman sort of inspired meditation on the human experience, and how our brains are basically this sort of dark chest of wonders of all these experiences and of all these insignificant inanimate objects and people and things that we've experienced, but they later come back to us as significant, and we realize that the sort of the meaning of our life is within all of the supposedly meaningless experiences that sort of culminate to a life long lived of not really being able to recall a lot of what we've experienced, and all the people that we've lost in our life, and all the love that we've lost, and all these beautiful spontaneous things that Thomas Wolfe is trying to tell us. And by the time we get to the last sort of 100 pages of the novel, Eugene Gant starts to finally write, and he talks about how the creative process, he would sit down for days and hours and just drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and staying up late, and he would just write all day long and then collapse in sort of this psychosis, and how the creative process was really this sort of otherworldly spiritual experience where this beast-like entity comes over him, and he just writes and writes and writes, purging himself of all the family tensions, of all the sadnesses of his life, but also of the hopes and of the potentials and the love that he feels for people. And we have some beautiful female characters in this as well. There's a lot of male characters, but also female characters. There's, elderly characters, child characters, middle-aged characters, and we get this juxtaposition of Thomas Wolfe's sort of experience of having to leave his youth behind, obviously, that we've talked about, but we also get his impressions of the humanity of the world, of the earth. And by the time we get to the end of the novel, through all the toils of the Gant family and of all the rushing tides of the river and of all Thomas Wolfe's weird ne'er-do-well friends and all of his late night time at the brothel, and he goes to the Louvre and sort of develops this obsession with we want to go see the Cimabue again. They go and look at this old Madonna painting of the Cimabue from the 1300s, old Renaissance painting of Cimabue, and just how these creative characters are constantly in this ebb and flow of creativity versus reality. And towards the end of the novel, Thomas Wolfe realizes that his time in Europe is up. He needs to go back to America to sort of rekindle his roots, to find his own way, and that he's sort of been swallowed up by the world. He's tried to eat the world. He's tried to experience everything. He needs to return to his roots. He needs that nourishment of the wandering, beautiful, epic American spirit. And towards the end of the novel, he is on the boat back to America, and he meets Esther Jack, which is the early stand-in for Elaine Bernstein, and he talks about these beautiful passages of falling in love with her. And he says here, he knew that from that moment his spirit was impaled upon the knife of love. From that moment on, he never was again to lose her utterly, never to wholly repossess unto himself the lonely, wild integrity of youth which had been his. At that instant of their meeting, that proud inviolability of youth was broken, not to be restored. At that moment of their meeting, she got into his life by some dark magic, and before he knew it, he had her beating in the pulses of his blood. Somehow thereafter, how he never knew, to steal into the conduits of his heart and to inhabit the lone, inviolable tenement of his one life. So, like love's great thief, to steal through all the adits of his soul and to become a part of all he did and said and was, through this invasion, so to touch all loveliness that he might touch, through this strange and subtle stealth of love henceforth, to share all that he might feel or make or dream, the old mangling chains of love. Just this beautiful recollection of when he first met Elaine Bernstein. And if it wasn't for Elaine Bernstein, we probably never would have had Of Time in the River. So shout out to Elaine Bernstein. I still want to study some of the novels and biographies that Elaine Bernstein wrote. There's correspondences of letters between Thomas Wolfe and Elaine Bernstein, but she sort of introduced him to the literary world. She encouraged him to submit his novels after numerous rejections. And the novel sort of begins with the man on that last final paragraph of the man leaving his youth behind and sort of submitting to the vast abyss of falling in love with a new woman and sort of going back to America to sort of recover his roots, to sort of stop the insatiable wandering of his late adulthood. So I hope you guys will be encouraged to read Of Time in the River. We managed to get through this in under an hour. We could really, it's all encompassing. We could talk about Of Time in the River for several hours, several days. And like I said, Of Time in the River is something that you will read endlessly throughout your life to constantly get nourishment from the beautiful, epic, and visceral pages of Thomas Wolfe's worldview. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you all sticking around. Sorry for the late upload, but we will get this video up to you soon. Make sure you guys check out the playlist. We've got some different playlists going over here on In-Depth Literature. We will talk to you all next time.